What's up guys, it's me, Coach Mills, and if you're trying to climb in Overwatch, you need tips and tricks on how to improve over every single character. So in this video, we're going to do exactly that and go through every single hero and give you one targeted tip that you could use to improve. So whether you're learning these characters for the first time or you're trying to master them, this is the perfect video for you. But do me a huge solid and smash that like and subscribe. We're so close to 50,000 subscribers and I'm trying to hit it, but let's jump into the video. Now, I've been coaching a lot on my Patreon, so I'm going to talk to the most common tip or mistake that will help you the most for each of these characters, and everything's in alphabetical order, so if you want to jump around in this video, no worries. Now, first off, let's talk about Ana. The biggest mistake that I see on Ana is that they're indisciplined with their normal ability and regular fire use. Now, you might be wondering what I mean by discipline. But basically, it's just using your primary fire, your resources like your nade in your sleep, or your time intently, and not reactionary or in a panic. This means that instead of just trying to lazily heal your teammate if you're trying to heal them by shooting from the hip from distance and jumping around while you do it, you're intentionally quick scoping in, zooming in and healing in a very specific way so that when you're trying to heal them, you do so deliberately and you're not wasting your own time because you're missing shots. On top of that, if you're using nade or if you're using sleep, you don't do it in a panic or in a reaction to someone initially doing a tiny bit of damage to you. You slow down and use these abilities deliberately, allowing yourself to set up the optimal situation to use it at the cost of your own health, which is just a resource that buys you time. The reality that you need to understand is that when you're jumped on by a Winston or when you're being pressured by an enemy, the vast majority of the time, you are not dying on Ana because you didn't use your abilities fast enough. You're dying because you used them, but you used them in a panic and missed them, and then you have no counterplay to what the opponent is doing. Well, the next character that we gotta talk about is definitely Ashe. Specifically, the tip I'll give you is about Bob. Now, with Bob, you really want to create space on the battlefield. And to create space, you have to think of Bob like as if Bob was something like a Winston, for instance. Not quite the same, but similar in concept, where he goes forward and creates a ton of space far away from the team. So putting a Bob right next to you or in the same direction as you is not going to create the space you want. You would much rather have Bob push past the enemy team onto an angle that sandwiches them between yourself and the Bob itself. So they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, no longer able to retreat back and give up space because the Bob is there, and not able to avoid damage because you're right on the other side. And if you put enemies in a pinch like this, they don't have cover that they can hide behind. They are trapped between walls of damage, and ultimately you will win a lot of fights this way. So really monitor your Bob usage. I think this is one of the biggest things that Ashe players are terrible at, regardless of the rank they're in. Next up, let's talk about Baptiste. Now, the biggest mistake that I see personally when coaching Baptiste players is that they abuse their jump, their high jump, a bit too much. You gotta understand that when you are in your jump, you are in a very, very trackable position. Track characters can kill you, hit scans, projectiles, or people with abilities like nade can time when you drop and hit you perfectly. This means that when you are taking the high ground, you need to make sure that the area is clear, or you're still using fundamentals of cover, allowing yourself to dip behind the corner, then hop up to the high ground, rather than hopping in the middle of open space. It's super easy to punish a Baptiste in that regard, so make sure that you don't just spam your Exa boost over and over again, because it actually could be the thing that is holding you back, because once you reach that threshold of players that are punishing you for it, you won't rank up past that. The next character that we have for you in this video is undoubtedly Bastion. Now, the thing about Bastion is his turret form, and it does have a long cooldown, but it's a little bit difficult to realize when you should go all in with the turret form or when you should actually remain passive, hold an angle, and things like that. You have to be hyper careful of things that are capable of stunning you, CCing you, things like hook, things like skewer. Some of this stuff is easier to play around than others, but ultimately you need to make sure that you are slicing the pie of an angle when trying to go out as Bastion. You're not of actually pushing out in front of your team, going out with your turret form and hoping that the opponent don't kill you, or you kill them fast enough for them to get their ability off. You are actually poking normally, baiting out cooldowns with your regular fire, and then as your team pushes forward, you are slicing the pie, as in slowly turning the angle far away from them, and you're slowly peeking more and more of the enemy while spraying them with bullets. This allows your team to handle a lot of the aggression and pressure and cooldowns that you would be taking. Plus, it also allows you to very slowly peak angles, which means that you can also unpeak an angle. You're not going full committal to an angle out of nowhere. And if you end up wanting to full commit to an angle, there needs to be something very deliberate that says that that's okay, or you have something that sets you up, like a Kitsune rush or something like a Lucio speed boost. The next character that we actually got to talk about is Brig. And this is just a playstyle thing that I really need players to understand about Brig, because a lot of people are still playing her like old Brig, and she just does not play that way anymore. Brig is not a tank. She's not a character that wants to go brawl on the front line. Brig is actually fragile by herself. What Brig actually thrives at is being that bodyguard, being that protector. And really, you want to stay closer to the back line with Brig than the front line, and you want to use your cooldowns to protect your teammates that are being pressured and force away enemies that want to dive on top of them. So Brig pairs very well with immobile DPS and supports. Characters like Cassidy, Ana, Zen. Brig pairs well with these characters as a form of protector, and the idea here is that because Brig can protect these characters, they will never ever die, and they'll be able to basically just keep outputting value. Now, that puts Brig in a pretty passive role, right? You're not making a ton of plays by yourself, but that is the primary and best playstyle of Brig, unless you have your ultimate and you can go a bit more aggressive. But all in all, Brig is not a pseudo tank or an aggressive character. She is a really, really passive character. So if you're still playing her like Brig 1.0, you're setting yourself up for failure, and it's only working against players that aren't punishing you. Now, next up, we do got to talk about Cassidy, and there's several things you need to consider about specifically your role. Remember that Cassidy roll actually neutralizes damage, so anything that could stick to you, it's actually going to be diminished if you time your roll properly as a defensive use case. So let's say you're stuck by another Cassidy, or you're stuck by Echo Orbs. Rolling at the optimal time right when those things explode will make it so you take a lot less damage. That's the first important thing, and that gives you a reason to utilize roll more defensively on average, because a lot of times Cassidys will only use your role aggressively, which can be okay, but if you're sacrificing your positioning onto the enemy, you have no way out, and there's too many of the enemies alive, then you could easily get dove, killed, and punished. So be very careful about it, and be deliberate with your rolls aggressively, and take note whenever you roll aggressively and die or feed. Next up, we got to talk about Diva, and I think I've done more coaching with Diva on the lower ranks than anything else, and the biggest mistake that I see is Divas not valuing their mech life. I think it's because Diva does get a second life. It's always seen as, it's okay if I lose my mech, I always can go into mini Diva. And the reality is, you need to think about Diva's mech as 90% of the character, or even 95% of the character. If you lose your mech, it's as good as death the vast majority of the time. And think about it this way. Diva has defense matrix, which is damage mitigation, mobility, and high health totals with armor. There is zero reason, if your supports are not dead, that you should be getting demeched on Diva unless positionally or ability-wise you are making a vital mistake. Use the high ground, don't be afraid to back up and fly back to your team, and make sure to conserve some amount of defense matrix for those key cooldowns like Nade and other cooldowns that you really need to stop, like Roadhog Hook. Next off, we do got to talk about Doomfist. The biggest mistake on Doomfist is not properly getting up enough charge punches on this character. Doomfist is a character that absolutely needs charge punch if he wants to make a proactive play. And if you go for a proactive play without it, most of the time you're not going to get any value. So how do you get charge punch? There's several ways to do it, but ultimately you need to make it seem like you are not in a position to use it and then take damage from it. So you could do the surprise method where you turn the corner and use it, which has mixed results. It's about 50-50. Or you could charge up a punch and cancel a punch into a block, and block is going to charge you up because they're going to think that you're going to commit to that punch and they're going to start shooting at you. So these are some of the examples, and then the other example is just by applying a ton of pressure on bad enemies, and they will reactionarily shoot you, and you're going to be able to get charge punches that way. But those are my big suggestions. Now, the next thing that we need to talk about is definitely Echo. And the big thing that Echo players don't know how to do is how do you ultimate? What do you do? Who do you copy? What character is best to copy? Now, you could say generally that Echo definitely thrives on tanks, with tanks being so powerful, but with that health change, Echo isn't always going to get guaranteed value on every single tank. And that's the most important thing. How much value are you going to get guaranteed right after you copy? So think of abilities that can guarantee that value. This could be tanking abilities like Bubble, for instance, or even an ability like a Kinetic Shield. But it can also be abilities like Mei Ice Wall. It can also be abilities like On a Nade. There's a ton of abilities that if they are used properly and you see the lines where you're like, hey, I could get value with that right when I copy, then you can actually go for these copies and try them, because there's not a perfect right or wrong answer. It's just about how much value do you think you can get off immediately right when you turn to the copy. Don't copy for ultimate. Don't copy that Genji trying to get a sick blade. Copy the character that gives you a very, very powerful and impactful ability that you can use right when you turn. And that's the way to get a guaranteed amount of floor value on this character with still having a very high ceiling. Now, speaking of Genji, let's talk about Genji. So the biggest mistake that I see on Genji is undoubtedly the fact that players just use their deflect before they are actually committing to a fight, and then they commit to a fight and they don't have their deflect. Think about deflect as more of a survival tool than a damage tool. Yes, you can deflect crazy things like an On a Nade, you can deflect a Widow headshot, you can deflect all kinds of stuff, and that's gonna come up. But you need to understand that when you are diving in for an aggressive play, you're going for a play, you're going for a kill, and there's a million things in this game that can stop that kill, right? Defense matrix, freaking Suzu, freaking burst healing, or Zarya bubble, or whatever. If you go in aggressively and you don't have your deflect, then you are gonna die. You're gonna die. But if you go in, bait all those things out, have deflect, use it to keep you alive, you can wait for your cooldowns to come back and then re-engage, and you will have that opportunity to fight the opponent when they don't have their cooldown. So this is really, really important. I'm not saying to never use it pre-fight if you have to. I'm saying that unless you're 100% going to get that kill, you need to really, really heavily consider before you go in and you don't have deflect in an aggressive way. And think of deflect more as a survival tool rather than a playmaking or damage tool. Next up, we do got to talk about Hanzo. And Hanzo specifically with his Dragonstrike, it can be hard to get value out of it, but let me give you a couple examples of things you can do. First off, getting solo kills with Dragon is still a fantastic trade. So ulting little cubbies that people are healing from, or little chokes where enemies are funneling through to get that one solo kill is oftentimes very, very worth it. But there's other examples on Hanzo where you can get a lot of value. With combos, of course, that's an obvious one, and one that you should be trying to set up a lot, but also to create space on point. If you're trying to contest last moment and you need to force the opponents off certain objectives so that your team don't have to all funnel onto it, Hanzo's Dragonstrike can be a great way to be a pseudo main tank or a pseudo tank in that moment. And that's something that you could do, and that's why it's a great recontestation tool, because damage ultimately creates said space. So getting solo kills, comboing, creating space, splitting the enemy team, these are some examples of ways you can use the Hanzo Dragonstrike to get more definitive value. But the next character that we got to talk about is Junkrat Queen. And the big thing that you have to do about Junkrat Queen is deselect her. I'm just kidding. Now, Junkrat Queen's ultimate is actually one of the most powerful ultimates in the entire game if you can connect it and if it doesn't get neutralized. So if you're up against a character like Kiriko, you are playing this funny game where you're applying pressure, you're poking, you're allowing your teammates to poke and deal damage, and you're listening and waiting for that bastard to use Suzu. And when they do, it's GG. It's game over. The ultimate will wipe them and you will get that dub. But do not just walk into a fight and initiate with your ultimate randomly. It's going to all get canceled. It's going to get all Suzu. Now, if the enemy team is in a straight line, but they're far away from one another, like let's say you could hit 3 or 4 of them, Kiriko included, and they're kind of far away from each other but in a straight line, you can still ultimate even into a Suzu, because oftentimes she will not be able to cleanse everybody, which means that you're still going to be able to get kills and value, and she's going to waste her Suzu. So that's one example, but just keep in mind how powerful this ultimate is. It should be team fight winning if you set it up properly. Next up, we do got to talk about Junkrat. The biggest mistake that I see on Junkrat is players wasting all of their resources to go in or deal damage in the poke, and then they don't have it to potentially make a mid-fight flank to try to get a burst kill, or they don't have any resources in the tank to actually run away. Very, very important that you conserve some amount of it in that mid-fight, and unless you're guaranteed to get a kill, I would definitely be careful about using that last mine in the bank, because if you get in a sticky situation, that's your only way out. So just be cognizant of that, and don't be afraid sometimes as Junkrat to just chill out and pause and wait for your cooldowns to come back before you go make any crazy plays. You get a ton of value just by poking in the mid-fight. You don't need to constantly be going for things and just walking out to the front line, using all your utility, and then playing passive. You're gonna have to play passive anyway, so why not give yourself more options and flexibility if an opponent tries to push you or punish you? Now, the next character that we definitely got to talk about is Kiriko. And the big mistakes that Kiriko players make is with Kitsune Rush. You have to understand that if you are going into a fight, if it's an overtime or it's a fight that's about to happen, you should be rushing early before the enemy team ults and trying to catch them when they're regrouping. This is such a huge mistake that Kiriko players make, where they want to rush at the perfect optimal time. But in doing so, they allow their opponents to engage first with ultimates, they allow their opponents to properly regroup, and they never allow them and their team the opportunity to snowball. Kitsune Rush isn't something that you have to set up perfectly optimally. Because of the forward momentum and the ability for you to punish enemies, it's a fantastic ultimate to use in advance when only 2 or 3 enemies are regrouping. Wipe them and don't allow them to have a real fight. Don't always use your Kitsune Rush defensively when your opponents are already being ulted on, already out of position, and oftentimes you'll pop that Kitsune Rush too late, your teammates will die, and you won't win the fight when Kitsune Rush should have won you the fight ages ago. Now, the next character that we got to talk about is Lucio. Now, the biggest mistake that Lucio players make is undoubtedly with his amp. And the thing that you need to understand is the true value out of Lucio comes from his speed boost. When you're trying to retreat from a fight or collapse on a fight that you have an advantage, Lucio can ensure a conserved fight where you pull back and regroup, or a wiped fight where you push forward and clean out the enemy. But you have to understand the value of this speed boost. And oftentimes, if you are amping up and amping up heals, it should be done only when absolutely necessary. Like your teammates would literally die without it. And most of the time, if you did amp up a heal, there was an opportunity for you to amp up a speed previously that would have allowed your team to get in better positions, push the enemy more aggressively, and create playmaking situations. And because they were just standing around sitting there because you weren't amping up and speeding, they're caught out, they're killed, they're damaged, and they're in a situation where now you feel like you have to heal when you could have avoided that situation altogether. But the next character that we got to talk about is definitely Mei. Now, the biggest mistake that you have to make sure that you see on Mei is you have to understand that, 1, your ultimate can be easily canceled by a number of different things, Suzu, Bubble, and even more. And 2, as Mei, you also need to understand how your ice wall can affect your own teammates. It's very, very easy to throw up an ice wall without caring about how your teammates are trapped, the flanks that your teammates are making. And while you're ultimately trying to trap people and get them killed between you and your team, keep in mind the general position of everyone on the battlefield and make sure that your wall doesn't actually cancel an ultimate, cancel a play, or mess up and get your teammates killed. Now, the next character that we got to talk about is definitely Mercy. And the biggest mistake that I see on Mercy is not specifically thinking about what characters on your team are worth pocketing and what players on your team are worth enabling. So Mercy's best value come from her res and from her damage boost, changing breakpoints, allowing you to get key pickoffs. And there's several characters that really thrive with said damage boost. Characters like Sojourn, characters like Hanzo, characters like Echo. And there's even more characters that really get value from res. Characters like Widowmaker that want to get key pickoffs. So there's a ton of characters that could be enabled by Mercy and basically enabled to get a lot more kills, a lot more damage, and generate y'all both a ton of ult charge. So these are characters that you should prioritize, but you should also prioritize characters and players on your team that have been overperforming. As a Mercy, you are the great observer, someone that should really get a tune in for exactly how good the players on your team are, how proficient are they at doing what they're supposed to do? And are they carrying with your help? If they are even just barely breaking even or doing very poor with you actually enabling and pocketing them, then doubling and tripling down on them is not gonna be the route to victory. And another key thing that you need to consider, and I know that typically there's a lot of Mercy players that don't like to communicate, but it is important to know that if you're in a really frantic team fight where the vast majority of the game you spent pocketing one person, enabling one person, but you want to go for a key res moment, you need to really consider how close the fight is, what's the risk in you going for a res, and what's the risk to your partner when going for a res. Because if they don't know that you're going for that res, they might be going for a play, going to clean out the fight, going to try to win the game. But if you go for that res, not only might you get killed, but they might get killed as well. So that lack of communication can be a problem, but it's all about trying to evaluate the overall team fight state. Is a res necessary for you to win the fight, or is it safer to not? And then evaluating your teammates to decide who is actually worth you enabling the most, and that's someone you should prioritize. If you're in a comp where no one's worth enabling, and also no one on your team or no hero is good at being pocketed, then honestly, Mercy might not be the best pick. But those situations will be few and far between. Next up, we do gotta talk about Morea. Now, Morea, the big mistake that players are making on this character is not healing when you need to heal and not damaging when you need to damage. I've basically VOD reviewed a ton of Moreas at this point, and I've found two types. The type that only heal. They are literally heal bots unless they can't heal anymore. They perma heal. Oftentimes they'll waste all their heals instead of tapping it like you should, because if you just tap someone with a heal, it heals them a lot over time. They're just dumping it all out. They're throwing heal orbs, and sure, this can be good, but Morea can bring a lot more value outside of just healing. This means that you can damage, and I'm not talking about just damaging orbs. I'm talking about shutting down flanks, shutting down plays, helping your team, enabling plays with your DPS. There's a lot of things that you can do as this character, and it's about finding that balance, because the other end of the spectrum that I found is I've literally VOD reviewed Moreas that have never once heal orbed. I'm not even joking. I've ran into them, and they don't heal orb. They just don't. And it's really important to understand that if your teammates are low, especially your tank, and they're weak, you could heal them up to full very, very quickly with an orb and a heal. And the thing is, when you keep healing up giant chunks of health in these really, really big situations, you're gonna build up your ultimate so fast. And then you can overwhelm the opponent with the play, like a damage orb into your ultimate, overwhelm, track a target, get a kill. So Morea can find that duality, but you have to heal when you need to heal, and you have to damage and be flexible when there's opportunities to do so. You can't do one or the other, and I'm tired of this stop DPSing Morea, or you need to DPS more to climb. It's in the middle. The truth is in the middle, as is most things. Now, I'm not gonna lie to you, I didn't imagine this video would be this long. It's already past 22 minutes, and that means we're gonna do the other 18 in part 2 tomorrow. So stay tuned for that one. Press that subscribe and like if you want to see that. I don't want my editor Shaden to hate me and drop him like a 40-minute video. So yeah, this is part 1. Let me know if you agree or disagree, if you have any questions about any of the characters we covered, and stay tuned for the next part in the future. Thank you so much for coming by. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.